What big figure did your love experience lead to? Story about an unexpected gift from a NASA guide. The story unfolds during the summer when a family trip to Cape Canaveral promised to be an ordinary vacation for everyone except one boy. He was 11 years old and his head was full of questions. Space beckoned to him, the way the sky pulls a bird upward. The boy knew no limit to his curiosity. He was the same child who not only dreamed of becoming an astronaut but tried to understand every detail: how much the shuttle weighs, how fast it flies, what loads it can withstand. For him, it was not just a tour of the NASA Space Center, but a real journey into another world. When the bus with tourists pulled up to the Space Center, his heart beat faster. He had never seen something like this before. Everything was huge and impressive. A hangar for shuttles, halls with mock-ups of rockets, simulators, and endless walls with pictures of astronauts. But most of all, the boy was attracted by the guide, a man who knew all the mysteries of space. He asked one question after another, not giving anyone a chance to focus on anything else. The guide answered patiently, with a slight smile on his face, clearly enjoying the enthusiasm of this young explorer. The tour seemed endless. The boy never tired of asking about everything he saw around him. The other tourists just listened, amazed by his thirst for knowledge. He did not just ask standard questions. He was interested in small things: how the fuel tanks were organized, how the angle of re-entry was calculated, what was the probability of a successful return to Earth. When the tour came to an end, the boy felt a slight sadness. He realized that now he would have to return to the real world, where space exists only in textbooks and photographs. Nevertheless, this day left a trace in his soul that seemed to live there forever. Later, when the whole family gathered for dinner at a local restaurant, the boy plunged back into his dreams, going over the details of the day in his head. The child was full of impressions, but he didn't expect the day to end there. As they were finishing dinner and getting ready to leave, the hostess suddenly approached the boy and handed him a small package. "This was left for you," she said. The boy took the bag with surprise. Inside was a space shuttle mission patch, just like the ones astronauts wear. The tour guide, whom he kept asking questions, had come into the same restaurant for a break, and seeing the boy, decided to give him a gift. This patch became a symbol of the day when a little boy's dream came into contact with reality. How I took to the skies unexpectedly. My first airplane ride was one of those moments when reality starts to seem unbelievable. On that summer day, my sister and I decided to take a walk near our grandmother's house. She lived in a small, quiet town that didn't have much in the way of entertainment, but there was a tiny municipal airport nearby. Local pilots used it for training flights, and every once in a while, small airplanes would take to the skies. My sister and I often found ourselves near the airfield, just watching the planes soar through the sky, dreaming of one day being aboard one of them. The sun was shining brightly that day, and nothing seemed to portend any amazing events. We were just walking past the airport fence, lazily talking about something of our own, when suddenly a man in his early 30s caught our eye. He looked like a typical hippie: long hair, brightly colored shirt, sunglasses. He seemed to be part of this atmosphere of freedom and adventure. The man noticed us looking at the airplanes and, to our surprise, offered us a flight. We looked over at my sister and me. The offer was so unexpected and strange that in any other situation we would probably have been scared, but at that moment everything seemed so natural that we just agreed. The airplane was small, more like an old corn cob. Inside, everything seemed so cramped and simple. The cabin, the instruments, the seats, everything was so far from those modern airliners I had seen on TV. But that only fueled my interest. Adrenaline began to pulse in my veins as the propellers began to turn, and we slowly lifted off the ground. At that moment, it seemed as if the world had slowed down and there was only us, the flying airplane, and the vast open sky. We were flying over our town, which seemed tiny because of the altitude. From the height, the river seemed like a shiny ribbon, and the houses we saw every day became little specks of color. The flight lasted about 20 minutes, but for my sister and me, it was truly a journey into a new world. It was a moment of freedom when all daily daily worries disappeared, and only the wind outside the airplane window reminded us that the world still existed. When we finally landed, the excitement still lingered. We walked off the plane with smiles to our ears, a story about a random excursion. Sometimes the most unexpected events can completely change our perception of the familiar world. This happened to me quite by accident during an ordinary walk around the city. I didn't have anything special planned that day. I just wanted to get some air and walk along familiar streets. My city seemed to be all over my head, streets I had grown up on, places I had visited dozens of times. It seemed like there was nothing new here anymore. But at that moment, something made me pay attention to a group of tourists who were moving a little ahead of me. The leader, a guide with a keen face, was telling something so interesting that people around were listening to him without taking their eyes off. I felt a slight curiosity and, without thinking, decided to follow. At first, I thought that it was a usual excursion to the historical places of the city, and I just wanted to entertain myself by listening to the old buildings and monuments, which I knew almost by heart. But from the very first words of the guide, it became clear that it was something completely different. It turned out that I accidentally got on a quest tour of mystical places in the city that I had never heard of. The guide told stories that seemed to open up a parallel reality for me. He pointed to buildings I walked past every day and told me about mystical events that supposedly happened here for centuries. I learned that there were places in my city that were associated with urban legends and ancient beliefs. The walls of an ancient mansion, which I had always walked past with indifference, suddenly turned out to be witness to strange disappearances and mysterious events. It turned out that in one of the parks where I liked to walk, rituals had once been performed, and to this day you can still sometimes see strange lights in the night. Every story the guide told gave me goosebumps. I was looking at familiar places with completely new eyes. The tour lasted about 2 hours, but for me, it was a whole trip into another world. A world I hadn't noticed, having lived here all my life. We walked through narrow streets where, according to the guide, inexplicable events happened, and at the end we stopped at an old building that seemed to be the source of all these stories. When the tour ended, I felt completely overwhelmed. My city suddenly opened up to me from a new side, as if it had a hidden face that I had never noticed before. After that evening, I could no longer just walk down the same streets without remembering the stories I had heard. Everything around me started to seem a little mystical, even if I realized that most of these stories were probably made up. But did it really matter? What mattered was that the city came alive for me in a new way. The story of the two-story with a secret. Every city has its secrets, hidden places that no one talks about. In my hometown, such a mystery was an old two-story building. It stood in the shadow of modern buildings and, at first glance, attracted no attention. Draped plaster, slightly shabby steps, faded windows. I often passed by this building, but never saw anyone going in or out of it. Each time I found myself near it, my interest only piqued more. What was inside? It looked like something that must be a forgotten time. One rainy evening, I decided not to procrastinate and took a look inside. You know how it is. You stand on the threshold of some inexplicable curiosity, and at some point, you just can't take it anymore. I went to the door and pushed it open. An unexpected silence greeted me inside. A narrow hallway with faded wallpaper, a staircase leading upstairs, and the faint smell of something appetizing, as if someone had just cooked something. I went up to the second floor, and what I saw surprised me more than I would have guessed. It turned out that this two-story building was a small family-run restaurant that no one knew about. There were only a few tables, set up by large old windows through which the light of the street lamps barely shone through. The atmosphere was unusually cozy, as if I was not in a restaurant, but in someone's home, where there had been no guests for a long time. There were old photographs and paintings on the walls, and a low humming sound came from the kitchen. There was an elderly woman with a kind face behind the counter, and the sounds of cooking could be heard in the kitchen. I sat down at one of the tables and looked around. It seemed that this restaurant was not just a place where food was served, but a real secret corner, hidden from the rest of the world. Surprisingly, there wasn't a single mention of it, neither on the internet nor among my acquaintances. Story about collector's watches and new life. Sometimes the most unexpected events can change your life. That evening, I had no idea that an ordinary party would turn out to be fateful. The atmosphere was relaxed. Music, conversation, glasses of drinks, and pleasant company. I sat down at my table, enjoying the moment, but soon my thoughts began to wander somewhere far away. And then, when I was almost lost in the routine of the party, my hearing caught something unusual. At a neighboring table, a guy was talking about a rare brand of collectible watch. It wasn't casual chatter. He was clearly knowledgeable about the topic. Interest and curiosity instantly gripped me. I've been fascinated by watches since childhood, but not many people shared my enthusiasm. Usually such conversations led to the interlocutor getting bored or changing the subject, but this was different. Unable to contain myself, I stood up and walked over to the stranger. When I spoke, it seemed rather spontaneous. Sorry to intrude, but I couldn't help but overhear your conversation about collectors' watches. The thought flashed through my mind that maybe this wasn't the best decision and the guy would think I was some kind of obsessive fan. But instead, he smiled broadly and immediately drew me into the conversation. We started discussing details that only true enthusiasts are familiar with. The model in question was a limited edition, and it was already a rare occasion that someone mentioned it in casual conversation at a party. Our conversation went on from rare watch models to other hobbies, music, movies, even travel. It turned out that we had a lot more in common than I might have initially thought. With each new spin on the topic, I became more and more convinced that this guy was someone you could talk to for hours. As the evening wore on, it seemed like we had been talking for ages. The people around us were changing, the music was getting louder, and we still couldn't stop. Some of my acquaintances even came over a couple of times to check if everything was all right. Probably they were surprised that I was so deep in conversation with a complete stranger, but I already realized that it was no accident. Eventually, the evening came to an end, but our communication did not end. We exchanged contacts and agreed to meet to continue our conversation, and that's how our friendship began, thanks to a simple interest and love for collectible watches. Many years have passed since then. We have become not just good friends, but the best. We've had many experiences together, traveling, parties, even joint projects. Sometimes I look back and think that if I hadn't dared to approach back then, that party would have gone on like an ordinary evening, and I would never have met the person who became an important part of my life. Story about came to the festival through a hole in the fence. 3 years ago, I dreamed of going to the Lollapalooza festival. For many people, it is a cult event, one of those exciting atmospheres where music, crowds, and the spirit of freedom create something truly unforgettable. But back then, like many young people, I was poor. Buying a ticket to the festival was something completely impossible. I just didn't have that kind of money. But even so, I was determined that I still wanted to be part of this event, even if not officially. My idea was simple. I would come to Chicago, walk around the fences of the festival, and just listen to the music from afar. The sound would spread around anyway, and while it's not quite the same as being inside, it was my way of getting a feel for the atmosphere, albeit through a fence. And so, on the day of the festival, I found myself in Chicago, not far from the park where everything was happening. The hustle and bustle was already evident everywhere. People with backpacks, dressed in brightly colored festival outfits, were already rushing to the entrances. Police officers were controlling traffic, and the smell of food and the inevitable music was in the air. I strolled along the fences, trying to see how close I could get to the stages to even remotely hear the performances. It was fun to see others going to the celebration of life while I watched from the outside. After about an hour of wandering, I came across a small hole in the fence. It was a barely noticeable opening between the fence mesh and the bushes, as if someone had tried to squeeze through before. I had no idea where it might lead me, and honestly, I hadn't planned on doing anything like that. It wasn't my intention to sneak into the festival illegally, but curiosity took over. What if we take a peek? I thought. Without thinking long, I climbed through the hole and found myself on the other side of the fence. At first, everything seemed the same as outside. Woods, bushes, a little trash around. But the further I walked, the clearer it became that I was moving somewhere deeper into the festival area. The sound of the music music got louder and louder, I started to hear the hum of the crowd, and people were flashing ahead. After a few minutes of walking, not realizing what I was even doing, I found myself right in the middle of the busy area. People around me were running back and forth, some carrying drinks, some taking pictures, and I stood there, lost and confused, not realizing how I got here. Everything was happening too fast. My heart was racing. I was on the festival grounds, but I didn't know what to do next. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a guard came up to me. I didn't even realize what had happened before he grabbed my arm. His face was a mixture of seriousness and bewilderment. He said sternly, "Hey, you can't come in here." I froze, thinking I was about to find myself behind the fence again. I expected the worst, to be kicked out or even fined for trespassing. But instead, in an absolutely ridiculous turn of events, he took me by the hand and literally led me out, right onto the festival grounds. I was standing amongst a crowd of people with deafening music all around me, bright stage lights, and it was all so unexpected that I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. I spent almost the entire evening at Lollapalooza that day. I didn't know any of the artists. I had no idea what was going to happen next, but the feeling that I was there by accident made it a truly memorable day. The story of how an accidental twist unlocked the mystery of Kentucky. When you're on the road, everything seems so predictable. The highway goes in one direction, the kilometers change into kilometers, and you drive with little thought of where the next turn will take you, especially when your goal is to get home, and it's a long way, as in my case, from my parents in Pennsylvania to Texas. Driving through Kentucky, I noticed one of those roads that seems to call you to turn off the highway. It was narrow and neat, as if it was specifically designed for those who want to break away from reality and explore the unknown. At that moment, something inside me clicked, whether it was a thirst for adventure or simple curiosity. The highway with its endless cars and gas stations suddenly lost its appeal, and I turned to this small road without a second thought. At first, everything went as usual. The road was quiet, the houses were less and less frequent, and I enjoyed the solitude. After about 5 minutes, the road became more winding, and the forest grew denser at the edges. The farther I traveled, the thicker the forest became, as if enveloping me, shutting me out from the noisy world outside. I knew that in situations like this, the smart thing to do was to go back to the highway, but something was holding me back. I decided to keep going, thinking that a few more miles wouldn't hurt. My bike rumbled softly beneath me as it made its way through the dense forest. Tree branches clung to the edges of the road, and I was beginning to wonder if it was even worth the risk for the unknown. At some point, the forest became so dense that the sun could hardly break through the crowns. The feeling of unreality grew stronger with every turn of the steering wheel, and then, a few minutes later, I made another turn onto a new road when the forest suddenly disappeared, revealing a picture that made me involuntarily slow down. It was a vast meadow, so vast that the eye could not encompass it all. It stretched for miles and miles ahead, verdant as in some fairy tale. Only the distant trees were visible on the horizon, and underfoot the thick, tall grass swayed in the breeze. It was as if someone had opened a gateway to another world where everything was quiet, calm, and beautiful in its pristine simplicity. I pulled the bike over to the side of the road and just sat there looking at the scenery. Time seemed to slow down. There wasn't a soul in the distance, and the whole meadow seemed to belong to me. The sun, which had been hiding behind the dense trees, now gently warmed me with its rays. A light wind played with the grass, making it move to the beat of nature's invisible music. I sat there, thinking about how small decisions, like this spontaneous turn off the highway, can lead to such unexpected discoveries. There were no houses or roads around, just the serenity of nature. This moment was one of those times when you feel like you're the only person in the entire universe in this place and time,